Okay, let's dive in. What if the very foundation we're building for our energy future is, well, fundamentally flawed?
It's a huge question.
It really is. And you've given us some fascinating material this week, these excerpts from a YouTube interview with Annalise Huygen. She's Emeritus Professor of Energy Market Regulation.
That's right. A lot of experience there.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to get to grips with her arguments, against this purely top-down energy transition.
And explore the alternative.
Exactly. Dig into that potential of local bottom-up approaches, which often feels a bit overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels incredibly relevant right now, doesn't it? Especially with those recent power outages in Spain and Portugal.
Yeah, that certainly got people talking.
Initially, all the talk was, cyber attacks, maybe Russian interference.
The usual suspects, almost.
But then the conversation shifted, didn't it, towards, well, maybe the grid was just overloaded. Potentially because of all the new renewables coming online.
It's a plausible factor, certainly. Integrating vast amounts of variable renewables is a challenge.
And the timing was striking right after Spain announced hitting a net zero point, even if briefly. It definitely fuels some skepticism.
It does make you pause and think about the bigger picture, the system's resilience.
Which perfectly frames the core tension we're looking at today. This massive, established, top-down energy infrastructure we all rely on.
The system we've had for decades.
Versus the possibilities, maybe largely untapped, of decentralized local energy solutions.
Precisely. And look, this isn't just about Spain and Portugal. Professionals, engineers in the energy sector, they've been flagging up concerns for a while now about the risks, the vulnerabilities baked into a system that's so heavily top-down.
So these warnings aren't new.
Not at all. And it absolutely applies here in the Netherlands, too. Our grid is deeply interconnected with the wider European network.
Which sounds good in theory, sharing power.
It has benefits,
Yeah.
absolutely, but this push towards one single enormous European grid. Well, the worry is, if we keep going down that path without seriously building up local resilience, we could actually be increasing the risk of really widespread blackouts if something goes wrong centrally, affecting huge areas.
Okay, so that's the risk. What's the alternative then?
Well, this is where Professor Huygens' idea comes in, this concept of loosely coupled local energy systems.
Loosely coupled.
Yeah, think of it like local grids. Maybe a neighborhood, maybe a small town that can largely operate on their own if they need to.
Self-sufficient, almost.
Mostly, yes, but still connected to the main grid for backup, for sharing power when there's surplus or deficit. Imagine your neighborhood being able to keep the lights on even if the main national grid has a problem.
That reminds me of something Marshall McLuhan talked about ages ago. He argued that electricity, perhaps counterintuitively, actually enables decentralization.
That's an interesting link.
And you see it happening, right? More people generating their own power, solar panels everywhere. It almost seems surprising that the whole green transition hasn't more fully grabbed onto this local energy potential.
Well, to understand that, you sort of need to look at the history, the trajectory of our energy systems.
Okay.
For, well, over a century, the driving force has been economies of scale. Bigger is better, cheaper.
Right, central power stations.
Exactly. We went from, individual streetlights in a city, they were run by a local generator, to interconnected city grids, then regional grids, then national ones.
And now international connections?
Precisely. And for most of that time, generating your own power just wasn't practical or affordable for ordinary people.
So when did that start to change?
The real shift, the possibility for more local production, began with the liberalization of the electricity sector. That was about, 20, 25 years ago?
Okay.
That's when things like putting solar panels on your own roof started to become technically possible, though back then they were still really expensive and, frankly, not very efficient.
Right, early days.
But to truly unlock the potential we're seeing now with local systems, it requires more than just technology. It needs a pretty significant cultural shift.
A change in mindset.
Yes. And that shift is currently, it's bumping up against the established interests and the whole incentive structure of the large existing energy companies. They've built their businesses around the centralized model.
Understandable from their perspective.
Of course. And you see this reflected in policy, too. Current energy laws, like the new heat law here in the Netherlands, they're still largely designed around that old top-down way of thinking.
So the rules haven't caught up.
Not really. And the projections within these frameworks for how quickly new local energy systems will be adopted, they often seem quite low. Surprisingly pessimistic even.
Even though the tech is moving fast.
Exactly. That's the irony. If you look at the technology itself, we're seeing incredible progress. Solar panels are much cheaper, much more efficient. You've even got flexible solar films now you can put on different surfaces.
Right, not just standard roof panels.
Heat pumps are becoming more mainstream. Energy storage, both batteries for electricity and ways to store heat, is getting better and cheaper all the time.
Like home batteries.
Yes, and larger community batteries, but also thermal storage. We're even seeing examples like hospitals looking at how they could potentially share their waste heat locally.
It feels like the technology is pulling in one direction, but the system is lagging behind.
That's a good way to put it.
And this really ties into Professor Huygens' long-standing argument for a bottom-up approach. It came through so clearly in her farewell speech, which we looked at.
Yes, she's been very consistent on this.
She often uses Denmark as an example, right?
Yeah.
As a place where this kind of local approach works.
She does. Denmark is a key reference point. They made different choices historically.
Thinking about Denmark, two things jump out for the Netherlands. There's standard processes for local projects, making it easier.
Yes, that's crucial. Standardization helps enormously.
And also their history, right? They started diversifying their energy way back after the 70s oil crisis.
Absolutely. A very different path compared to the Netherlands, which became heavily reliant on its natural gas reserves.
But to be fair, we are seeing rapid tech development here in the Netherlands too, aren't we? In renewables, in storage.
Oh, definitely. The technological capability is certainly growing here.
And we do tend to be pretty quick adopters of new tech as a country.
Generally, yes. There's an appetite for innovation.
Okay, but this leads to a really critical point Professor Huygens made in her speech. The need for a long-term perspective. She talked about, what, a 25 to 30-year horizon?
Yes. Making decisions about energy infrastructure requires thinking decades ahead, not just about the next few years. These are massive, long-lasting investments.
And central to her thinking, it seems, is this neighborhood-centric idea, starting the whole energy question right down at the local level with the user.
Exactly. That user perspective is so fundamental, and yet it's kind of remarkable how often the actual end user seems to get lost in these grand energy plans.
How so?
Well, the focus tends to be very system level. Think about plans to use waste heat from a massive industrial area like Rotterdam.
Okay, sounds efficient on paper.
On paper, perhaps, for the overall system. But the really crucial question is piping that heat all the way to Leiden, for example, actually the best, most cost-effective solution for the individual homes in Leiden? Maybe not.
Right, maybe a local solution would be better there.
It might well be. Yeah. And we also have to consider how energy needs in homes are changing.
Good point.
Demand for heating is generally going down, right? Better insulation, warmer winters overall.
Yeah, definitely notice that.
But demand for cooling is shooting up. Air conditioning is becoming more common, and electricity use is set to rise dramatically. Electric cars, more gadgets.
So the demand profile is shifting.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the exciting part is how local tech is evolving to meet this. Those more efficient solar films I mentioned, they can go on facades, different roof types, more places, basically.
More local generation potential.
Exactly. And battery tech is getting cheaper, lighter. That's for electricity storage. But also, heat storage is becoming more practical and affordable.
Heat storage, how does that work locally?
Well, it connects to this idea of lower temperature heating networks. Instead of piping super hot water long distances.
Like the 120 degrees from Rotterdam you mentioned.
Right. These networks operate at much lower temperatures, say 20 to 50 degrees Celsius.
Okay, what's the benefit?
Several. They're much more efficient, less heat loss. They're cheaper to install smaller pipes, less insulation needed. And crucially, they can use a much wider range of local heat sources.
Like what?
Waste heat from a local hospital, heat generated by subway tunnels, warmth from surface water like canals or lakes, even heat rejected by supermarket refrigeration systems. Lots of untapped local potential.
Wow, okay. So you could piece together a local heat supply from various nearby sources.
Precisely. And then you start thinking about neighborhoods where homes and maybe local businesses can share and store this energy collectively.
So my excess solar power could help heat my neighbor's house.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Or charge a community battery. That's the essence of these loosely coupled systems, local grids that manage themselves mostly, but are still connected for backup and trading.
It feels almost like a philosophical shift. The Industrial Revolution was about dominating nature, being independent from it. Maybe this is about a new kind of interdependence, enabled by tech, but rooted in local context, community.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. But, and it's a big but, the current rules, the laws and regulations we have in the Netherlands, they often get in the way.
Oh.
They unintentionally make it harder to set up these kinds of loosely coupled local systems. The whole framework is built for the big centralized model.
So the system needs to catch up with the philosophy or the potential.
Absolutely. It really requires flipping the logic.
Yeah.
Instead of starting top down, we need to start by asking, what resources do we have locally?
Right here in this neighborhood.
Yes.
Huh.
Is there surface water, a metro line nearby, a hospital, a supermarket with waste heat? What are the actual energy needs of this community? And then build the solution from that understanding.
So no more one size fits all?
Definitely not. And you have to factor in that people might already have solar panels or a heat pump. You need freedom of choice for individuals, for neighborhoods, for the local municipality.
The whole heat network discussion seems to be a flashpoint for this conflict.
It really is. You have this strong push for these very large centralized heat networks.
The Rotterdam-Leiden pipe dream, so to speak.
Exactly. But the scientific thinking increasingly points towards these lower temperature local networks being potentially much more efficient and cost-effective.
Why the push for the big ones then?
Oh, partly inertia, partly existing investments, partly the established way of thinking. But look at that Leiden example again. Transporting 120-degree water over such a long distance.
The cost must be huge.
The infrastructure cost is enormous, yes. And think about the heat losses along the way. Plus, how well does that actually fit with more and more homes generating their own electricity with solar panels, especially as net metering is phased out?
What's net metering again?
That's where homeowners get credited for the excess solar power they feed back into the grid. As that's reduced or removed, people will want to use more of their own solar power directly.
Ah, so they might not need as much external heat, especially in warmer months.
Exactly. So you risk building this incredibly expensive centralized heat network that's massively underutilized for large parts of the year, especially summer.
Like having a giant furnace that's barely ticking over most of the time.
It's a real risk of stranded assets. All that capital tied up in infrastructure that isn't being used efficiently.
And these big projects, they tend to get more expensive too, don't they?
History tells us they often do. That Leiden Heat Network project is already facing significant cost increases compared to the initial plans.
On top of that, you mentioned the government pushing for larger regional heat companies.
Yes, there's a trend towards consolidation. And the concern there is that it takes decision-making power further away from the local level.
Away from municipalities.
And ultimately away from the citizens, the consumers who actually use the heat and pay the bills.
You know, that sounds depressingly familiar. It feels like a pattern in the Netherlands, this preference for scaling up. We saw it in education, in healthcare.
You're absolutely right.
Often with promises of efficiency that didn't quite pan out, and sometimes less focus on the individual user, the patient, the student.
Exactly. That bigger is better mantra seems incredibly persistent in policy circles here, including energy policy.
Even if the evidence doesn't always back it up.
Well, there's certainly not strong academic consensus that bigger is always better, especially when you consider the potential downsides of loss of local control, sometimes higher costs in the long run, maybe lower quality service, as we've arguably seen in some of those other sectors you mentioned.
Why does it persist then, this drive for scale?
That's a complex question. Partly inertia, partly perhaps the perceived power and influence that comes with running larger organizations. It's a mindset, maybe.
And those promised efficiencies.
As you said, they haven't always materialized. Increased costs, sometimes bureaucratic hurdles, maybe a dip in quality or responsiveness. It's happened.
And it feels like the energy transition might be heading down a similar path, leaning heavily on these big top-down solutions.
It does seem that way. It's ironic, isn't it? The Netherlands often describes itself as a decentralized unitary state, emphasizing local government responsibilities.
Power to the municipalities.
Yet, in practice, there's this constant counter-tendency towards centralization, towards scale enlargement. It's a contradiction.
So the big question then, Professor Huygen, is can we actually change course? Is it too late to steer towards a more decentralized, bottom-up energy future?
Oh, I definitely believe a shift is possible. But I suspect it won't come primarily from the top.
Where will it come from then?
It needs to come from citizens, from communities, from successful local initiatives that actually demonstrate that these alternative approaches work, that they're viable and effective.
Grassroots momentum.
Precisely. And, you know, it's really striking. When I attend meetings with these local energy cooperatives, groups focused on neighborhood solutions.
Yeah.
The energy in the room is incredible. There's enthusiasm, innovation, a real can-do attitude. People are passionate about making it work for their community.
And compared to?
compared to, frankly, the often more bureaucratic, sometimes quite stagnant atmosphere you find in discussions with the big established energy players and administrators. It's a different world.
What about the argument you sometimes hear, the cherry-picking concern, that local solutions might only work in areas with specific advantages, like a nearby hospital for waste heat?
That's a fair point to raise. But look, my feeling is right now the absolute priority should be getting some successful, cost-effective projects off the ground, wherever we can.
Prove the concept.
Exactly. We need those examples, those models, to show what's possible, especially given how incredibly high heat costs are for consumers in the Netherlands compared to many other countries. We need breakthroughs.
So focus on getting wins first, worry about perfect equity later.
Well, fairness is obviously crucial in the long run. But if we hold back every promising local project now because it might not be instantly replicable everywhere, we risk grinding everything to a halt.
And killing that local enthusiasm you mentioned.
Precisely. You discourage the very engagement we desperately need for this transition.
It does seem like a paradox, doesn't it? We're aiming for sustainability, a green transition, yet Dutch consumers face some of the highest energy prices in Europe.
It is a paradox, and it's complicated. Part of the high cost for consumers is down to environmental taxes, which is a deliberate policy choice.
Okay, so it's not just the base price.
Not entirely, but the underlying energy prices themselves. It's not straightforward. For instance, energy costs for Dutch industry are actually relatively low compared to other European countries.
Even though they complain about network costs hindering their green efforts.
Yes, that's another part of the complex picture. But focusing on heat, which is a major part of household energy use, we saw that consolidation, right?
Down to just 4 or 5 big companies.
Yes. And initially, the idea was consumer protection through regulated tariffs, that NMDA principle. Niet meer dan anders, not more than otherwise.
Linking heat price to gas price.
Exactly. But then the government, wanting people to switch away from gas, increased the taxes on natural gas quite significantly.
Okay.
And because the heat price was pegged to the gas price via NMDA, the heat price shot up too.
Whoops. Unintended consequence.
A major one. And this happened even if the heat company's actual costs, maybe they were using cheaper waste heat from incineration, for example, hadn't gone up nearly as much.
But they could still charge the higher gas-linked price.
They followed the regulated tariff structure. And adding to the problem is a real lack of transparency about the actual operating costs of these big heat companies, which are often private or partly private entities.
We don't know what it really costs them to produce the heat.
We don't have a clear, standardized picture, which makes it hard to judge if the price is fair. And look, the results can be quite shocking.
Give us an example.
Those student flats in Leiden you mentioned earlier, facing fixed heating costs of 800 euros a year. That's before they use a single unit of heat. Just the connection fee, essentially.
800 euros just to be connected.
Yes. Compare that to costs in neighboring countries like Belgium. It's vastly different. It really makes you question the effectiveness of the oversight and the expertise within the system.
Has anything changed recently on that front?
Yes, the government has intervened. Steps have been taken to decouple heat prices from gas prices, finally, and the new heat law does introduce cost-based tariffs.
So prices should reflect actual costs now.
That's the intention. But, and this is critical, it will only work effectively if we have clear, standardized accounting rules so we can actually compare costs properly and ensure transparency.
Makes sense. And you contrasted the few large Dutch companies with Denmark.
Right. The Netherlands has maybe 4 or 5 dominant players. Denmark has around 350 heat companies, many of them local, often cooperative or municipally owned, much more diversity, much more local control.
So back to the big question. How do we shift away from this dominant top-down approach here?
Well, we're currently in a situation where there's a real divergence. On the one hand, you have the ongoing rollout of these large-scale heat network plans.
The ones conceived a few years ago.
Exactly. Often planned around 2018, based on the thinking then. But on the other hand, the scientific consensus, pretty much since 2020 onwards, has increasingly pointed towards low temperature, local systems being more efficient and likely more cost-effective.
So the plans are based on outdated ideas.
In many cases, yes. The understanding of what's optimal has moved on significantly thanks to research and technological development.
But the big projects keep rolling.
It points to that cultural issue again. A real shift in thinking is needed within the established energy world to truly embrace these decentralized approaches. There's often still a lack of deep understanding or perhaps willingness to explore these alternative models among policymakers.
Unlike the local groups you mentioned.
Right, those cooperative groups often dive deep into studying examples like Denmark. They know what's possible.
And we shouldn't just dismiss local ideas if one project fails, right? Big projects hit hurdles, too.
Absolutely. We need a fair comparison. Failures happen at all scales. We shouldn't use an isolated local failure to discredit the entire approach, especially when large-scale projects face their own significant challenges and cost overruns.
So the picture now is this tension. Big plans moving forward, but facing citizen resistance, high prices, and growing doubts about whether it's the right path.
Exactly. And it's crucial to keep saying the science and the technology increasingly support the idea that decentralized energy can often be more efficient, more resilient, and more cost-effective.
So what needs to happen legally or regulatorily?
We need frameworks that actively support freedom of choice for citizens, for communities, laws that enable, not hinder, these local energy solutions.
Like that loosely coupled idea.
Yes, we need ways to legally structure and facilitate these local initiatives, allowing them to connect and interact with the main grid effectively, but also operate independently when needed.
That must be challenging for the big existing energy companies.
Undoubtedly. It challenges their business models, their investments in the current large-scale infrastructure. It's a difficult transition for them, too.
And didn't you mention the new heat law pushes for public ownership?
Yes, interestingly, it aims to bring private heat companies back into majority public ownership, over 50% required.
Making them public utilities again.
In a sense. Though how that plays out in practice, transferring ownership, could be very complex.
Do you support that public ownership?
I do think public ownership can be beneficial if it ensures genuine citizen influence. Personally, I think that influence is strongest when ownership is at the municipal level. Local accountability.
Closer to the people using the service.
Exactly. But right now, the whole heat transition seems a bit stuck, doesn't it?
Feels like it's stalled. Why?
Well, partly it might be this whole complex debate around public ownership of large companies, but perhaps also there's a growing realization, maybe implicitly, that the current top-down plans are just proving too expensive and aren't very popular with the public.
At the new heat law itself, you have criticisms.
My main criticism is its narrow focus. It's just about heat. It mandates that municipalities make decisions about heat networks for every single neighborhood.
Okay.
Often based on historical energy use data, which might be completely wrong for the future. It fails to take an integrated look at the neighborhood level, considering electricity, cooling and heating together, projecting future needs, assessing local resources.
Instead of just mapping out heat pipes based on old gas usage.
Precisely. There's been this, frankly, worrying over-reliance on complex modeling, often using incorrect assumptions or parameters. And then you see different consultants basically repeating the same flawed calculations.
Which leads to bad plans.
Leads to plans that face significant citizen resistance when people realize the costs and implications.
And financial risks for municipalities, too.
Huge risks. They might end up having to guarantee the financing for these incredibly expensive networks where the final costs are very uncertain.
How does Denmark avoid this complexity? You said it was simpler there.
It seems much more straightforward. A local group develops a plan, often based on standardized approaches. They present it to the municipality and the citizens. There's discussion, feedback, and then typically a single, clear decision is made. Less bureaucracy, more transparency.
But does that require different skills within the municipalities here?
Yes, absolutely. It requires a cultural shift within local government, too.
Yeah.
And different kinds of expertise to facilitate and evaluate these decentralized proposals.
Is that the bottleneck, municipal capacity?
I think a key problem is the narrative that's often pushed, that municipalities somehow aren't capable of managing their own energy transitions. That narrative then justifies the push for the big external companies to come in and do it.
Whereas in Denmark,
It's considered normal for a municipality or a local cooperative to set up and run a heat company. Why? Because they have standardized processes, readily available knowledge, templates.
Right.
It's not seen as some insurmountable task.
standardization again.
It's so important. Standard forms, standard accounting, standard ways to calculate tariffs. It makes everything easier to understand, compare, and implement locally.
And you think local initiatives are more innovative?
Often, yes. Large companies can be quite conservative. Local initiatives are usually much better placed to understand the specific potential of local resources and tailor solutions creatively. They have the local knowledge.
Okay, final question. Crystal ball time. Looking ahead, say, the next 5 years in the Dutch energy transition, what do you see happening?
Well, I think there are broadly two possible paths.
Okay.
Path one. We see increased recognition and genuine support, financial, regulatory, for these local initiatives. If a few really successful, cost-effective local projects emerge and get visibility,
they could act as catalysts.
exactly, we could see quite rapid progress down that bottom-up route. Path 2, we continue to double down, investing heavily in the large-scale top-down system.
And the risk there?
The risk there is creating massive stranded assets. Expensive infrastructure that becomes obsolete or underused is cheaper. More efficient local solutions become undeniable.
So the key is?
The key is creating a truly level playing field. Small-scale local projects need to have the same access to support, finance, and regulatory pathways as the large-scale ones. Right now, with things like the new heat law and how subsidies are often structured, that's often not the case.
It really does give us a lot to think about. Professor Huygens, thank you so much for walking us through this, for this incredibly insightful deep dive. It's clear there are huge questions still being debated.
My pleasure. It's a critical moment for these decisions.
Absolutely. I have a feeling this is a topic we'll definitely need to revisit in the future.